All right. Okay. So I guess we're about to start. Thank you for coming. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to SHSU Political Science Department speaker series. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Dennis Wan. I am an assistant professor of political science and also the global outreach coordinator at Sam Houston State University. Also, I am the coordinator for the conference group of Taiwan on Taiwan study at American Political Science Association. It is my great honor to welcome all the distinguished guests and speakers to join us today. Well, this is my the fourth consecutive year to organize this U.S. Taiwan relations speaker event. I'm very fortunate to receive some support from the Greater Houston area and also from the Taiwanese, Taipei Economic and Culture Office. So this is my fourth time to organize this, but this is the very first time we organize this online due to the pandemic. While I hope I can invite everyone on campus, come to Texas, enjoy the weather and enjoy our beautiful campus. But the pandemic stopped us to do that. But the new technology allowed us open another door to the whole world. So you can now join us on via Zoom or on YouTube. I know some people joining us on YouTube tonight. Hopefully you will enjoy our discussion today. The U.S.-Taiwan relation is extremely important. Hopefully the two speakers tonight, I invite two speakers, one from Taiwan and one from the U.S. They can both provide a great insight about the U.S.-Taiwan relations, especially in President Biden's the first 100 days. So before we start the formal presentation, allow me to welcome our dean, the host, our dean, Jianbing Li, to give a welcome remark. Professor Li is also a permanent scholar in U.S.-Taiwan-China relations. He is one of the most influential Taiwanese political scientists in the U.S. So let's welcome Professor Li.
Well, thank you, Dennis, for this kind introduction. And good morning to our friends in Taiwan, and good evening to our friends in the United States. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to this virtual forum and to have a conversation on the U.S.-Taiwan relations. As all of you know, that historically, there is no doubt that the U.S.-Taiwan relations have played an important role in contributing to the peace and prosperity in East Asia. And we can confidently say that for the foreseeable future, the bilateral U.S.-Taiwan relationship will continue to have profound implications for the region as well as for the rest of the world. So I would like to thank Professor Wang for his great work in bringing together two distinguished scholars to discuss this important topic. And at Sam Houston State, we pride ourselves on promoting international awareness and understanding. Although due to the pandemic, we have temporarily suspended our exchange programs and study abroad programs, we look forward to the opportunity to re-engage internationally very soon. And for the past several years, many people have helped us promote this international mission and vision. But there is one person in particular we would like to recognize tonight, and that is Mr. Don Wang, Wang Dunzheng, 董事长. He's joined us tonight and in attendance. Mr. Wang has generously supported our study abroad programs and many other events related to U.S.-Taiwan educational exchange. So thank you so much, Mr. Wang. We appreciate all your support. And thank you for joining us tonight. Again, welcome to all of you. And I look forward to the comments and insights from our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee, for the warm and warm welcome remark. Indeed, I sincerely appreciate Mr. Wang's support and all the support from the Taiwanese community in Greater Houston area. Since moving to Houston in 2017, I received a lot of support from the local Taiwanese American community. They help us organize event and join attending my the speaker event to support not only me but the department and also the university. So I really, really appreciate everything you have done for the program and for the university. Next, I'm going to welcome Professor Jason Nania. As I mentioned, Jason is not only my great colleague, is also a friend of Taiwan. He's been to Taiwan before. So I assume you will say something very nice about Taiwan. Jason.
Thank you, Dennis. Yes, on behalf of the Political Science Department here at Sam Houston State University, it's a pleasure to welcome our speakers, our distinguished guests, Dean Lee, Mr. Wang, and everyone watching on the live stream on YouTube to this important conversation. Here in the Department of Political Science at Sam Houston, we have 20 full-time faculty members, a number of whom are with us on the call tonight. Approximately 200 undergraduate majors, several hundred students who are minoring in political science, and 2 graduate programs. We have an MA program in political science and a master's in public administration program. And over the years, we've seen an increased interest among students in international issues. And so we're excited to host conversations like this and to expose students to a wide variety of political issues, not just US politics, not just Texas politics, but indeed international politics. The Political Science Department is also home to what some might see as a surprising number of connections to Taiwan. As Dennis mentioned, we have 2 faculty members who are originally from Taiwan, a number of others who have lived in Taiwan, taught in Taiwan, a few of us who have traveled in Taiwan, one of whom, as Dennis mentioned, was me. I was lucky enough to travel there with Dennis, which is a great way to visit Taiwan a few years ago now, and had a wonderful week meeting people, visiting schools and universities, and building partnerships with several Taiwanese institutions. And finally, there are several faculty members who have been conducting research on the politics of Taiwan, Taiwanese security, the U.S. Taiwan relationship, and East Asian security more generally. As I said at the outset, and as Dean Lee mentioned, this is an important conversation. The Taiwanese-U.S. relationship is not only important in its own right, but obviously has implications for the security in the region and across the globe. So welcome to everyone. We're happy you're here and look forward to a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Jason, for the remark. As Jason and Professor Lee mentioned, the U.S.-Taiwan relations, many of you have already know that U.S.-Taiwan relation is extremely important. Some people would even argue that Taiwan Strait is the flashpoint at this moment in the world. It's most dangerous or most important place in the world. Actually, in the past 4 years, many of the agenda presented in our previous speaker event predict accurately about Taiwan Strait and U.S.-Taiwan relations. I'm sure today's presentation, the 2 speakers provide insight about U.S.-Taiwan relations will also generate a lot of interesting discussion in today's meeting and also for future discussion. Okay, now before we start a formal presentation, just a little bit housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions in the Zoom meeting room, if you have any question, you can type your question in the chat room so we can collect all the questions. At the end of the presentation, we have a Q&A session. If you have any question, if you're watching on live stream on YouTube, if you have questions, you can type in the comments and we will try to collect some questions from YouTube as well. Okay. Now, I'm going to introduce you the first speaker for tonight is Professor Alexander Huang. Professor Huang is a professor at Institute of Strategic Study of Taikang University. He's a founder and chairman of the Council on Strategic Wargaming Study in Taiwan. Dr. Huang previously served in the ROC, Republic of China, Taiwan government as Deputy Minister of Mainland Affairs Council, and has been working closely with consecutive government on foreign and security policy matters. Dr. Huang did his graduate work at School of Foreign Service, MSFS, Georgetown University, and Department of Political Science, George Washington University, where he received his doctoral degree. Dr. Huang specialized in Asian and Chinese foreign policy, security affairs, and has been frequently interviewed by international news agency and local media. If you're in Taiwan, you probably see Professor Huang, his very familiar face. He's on TV all the time. He's also a frequent columnist for United Daily, the China Times, many important news outlets in Taiwan, and also international news outlet as well. So without further ado, we will turn the time over to our first speaker, Professor Alexander Huang.
Well, thank you, Dennis, and my thanks goes to your university, Dean Lee, department chair, and all the faculty members, students who are interested in this subject. I want to focus my presentation on the so-called first 100 days of the Biden administration and related to that to the U.S. Taiwan relationship. I think there are at least three factors that keep the U.S. Taiwan relations sound in the first 100 days of the Biden administration. The first one is that the U.S. China relations has not changed that much. The strategic competition that had been in place for several years continues as the biggest factor when Washington policymakers think of their strategy and policy toward Beijing as well as to Taipei. Given the general environment remain constant, that there would force on a policy continuity in a sense, if we are talking about the United States national interest, and the Biden administration take different approach, but encounter the similar environment that the Trump administration had left. So I think the first is the continuity of the international situation, especially the continuity of the U.S. China strategic competition. We all knew that it's going to be a long-term competition going for 15, 20, 30 years. So with this, general outlet, we don't see much directional change of the Biden administration, at least in the first 100 days. We understand that President Biden had at least given the Pentagon a 4-month period to give a cross-agency overall review of American China policy and strategy. And if we calculate the timeline, it's gonna be due in June. So we still have like a month or two to go through this review period. As we understand now that the Pentagon report will be classified and we will not be able to have access to. But at least we know that the time frame that we are still in the process of reviewing an overall strategy toward China. The second observation is that the continuity of the U.S. Taiwan programs. We don't see any change of the Biden administration to redirect the existing programs from CGTF with Taiwan to helping Taiwan to increase its visibility international arena, even for a Taiwan, policy review or Taiwan exchange guidelines. We see the continuity that the Biden administration continue to expand and number one, remove the inappropriate restrictions that set 42 years ago and given a more positive view on the formal exchanges between Taiwan's diplomat with the United States federal officials. We know we have gone a long way to this stage. The Taiwan Policy Review of 1994 under President Clinton was a big, change. And finally, at this moment, we have a new Biden administration follow the same spirit and offer Taiwan a more officiality and more normal, what I call U.S. Taiwan exchange relationship. Thirdly, I would say the personnel. Even before the election, we in Taiwan, we all knew that there are many friendly faces, familiar faces that helping the Biden campaign. As a result, in the earliest phase of the appointments of national security officials, President Biden had nominated, and appointed many, good friends of Taiwan that we have known for, if not decades, but many, many years. From the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Secretary of State Tony Blinken. They too had all visited Taiwan, and they know Taiwan very well, and including the both sides of the aisle, blue and green. So they got a general picture about what Taiwan is, what the situation, and what's the problem across the Taiwan Strait. And in a general sense, I have to say that these guys are close to President Biden, and they know what the president think, and they know what's the Taiwan situation. I think that served, the first layer of the policy making structure. And then we have quite a few familiar faces, like Dr. Kurt Campbell at National Security Council, overseeing the Asia policy. And we have Rosenberger, who had also visited Taiwan several times and had many, many academic exchange and collaborative work with Taiwan before. And we had Dr. Michael Chase from RAND, who is now appointed the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, and specifically on working on China. So over the Pentagon, we had Eli Rotner, we had Michael Chase. So the third tier of this first 100 days is that we got the many good friend of Taiwan being appointed. They are American patriot, but they understand that we had shared values, and we had experience working together before. Even personally, Dr. Campbell and I were colleagues next door on the 5th floor of CSIS back in the late 90s. So we have a long accumulated friendship. We got the right people and the right policy in the first 100 days. Having said all this, I want to turn to part two of my presentation. Given all the positive signs and the record in the first 100 days, we are still encounter three potential problems between Washington and Taipei, between the United States and Taiwan. And I will share with you in the following manner. The first potential problem is the understanding or the perception of China. You know, we are in the very early stage to observe how the Biden administration view China. We know it's a peer competitor. United States and China is in a long-term strategic competition, but there is a kind of important element about what I call strategic estimate. Does Taipei, do Taipei and Washington share that estimate? Let me be more precise. When President Xi Jinping or General Secretary Xi Jinping of the Chinese Communist Party said that he envisioned the rise of the East and the decline of the West. And that's his judgment or his estimate for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And he assumed and argued that the time and posture are on the side of Beijing. And of course, we understand that's a Chinese version and how Xi Jinping look at the world that China is facing. My question is whether the Biden administration officials and Taiwan in general sense share Xi Jinping's estimate, or we have a common argument that rebut Xi Jinping's assessment. Do we agree, or to what extent that we agree that the East is on the rise and the West is declining? Do we have a perception gap between Washington and Taipei on this one? We should, do some real groundwork, not only by speeches or government statement. We need to do surveys. We need to go to the people and look, and even look at the gap between the elite and the general public on their views, related to the future of China. I think that's the first one. The second, worry or problem that might exist between Taipei and Washington is another perception gap. The perception of whether Taiwan Strait is the most dangerous flashpoint of the world, and military action or an invasion is expected in the near term if China invaded Taiwan. I worry about this even more than the first perception gap, because it may bring a lot of misperception or misunderstanding between Taipei and Washington and among the policymakers. We see the polls in Taiwan in the past 2 years that most general public believe that China will never use force against Taiwan to resolve the political differences across the Taiwan Strait. Is that true? Why Taiwan has this, this kind of general perception. The figure The lowest figure was 52%. The highest was 79.6% of the Taiwan general public do not believe that Beijing will use force against Taiwan to resolve the political differences. And that's a huge gap from what we have learned, from Twitter's, LinkedIn's, journal articles, even novels, and especially it's different from the testimony by the Admiral Philip Davidson in front of the Armed Forces Committee of the United States Senate, when he spelled out that he worried that the Chinese may use force against Taiwan in the next 6 years. So the perception gap on security matters between the United States and Taiwan is dangerous to me, because if most Taiwan people do not believe that there will be a war, then we will not have the social support necessary for defense modernization, for increase of defense budget, even to recruit of the volunteer force. If the gap persists, then we will see more pressure from Washington, especially from Pentagon, to force Taiwan to do necessary steps to prepare itself in any case of a possible Chinese military invasion. I think this perception gap is also a problematic issue between Taipei and Washington. And the third, potential problem between Taiwan and the United States is that the Taiwan's role in future of China. For sometimes, especially during the Trump administration, Taiwan was seen as a card, as a tool, or as a spearhead, to intimidate Beijing whenever people want to do it. And so far, in the first 100 days of the Biden administration, I see that Washington changed the expectation on Taiwan and changed the role from spearhead to shield. And Taiwan being expected as a shield to defend the democratic institutions, the universal values, and the shared interests between Taiwan and the United States and its allies in the Indo-Pacific region. I call that as, gatekeeper, that Taiwan is a gatekeeper for defending democracy, defending human rights, defending the values that we share. But I have to say that Taiwan had long played another role, not only as a gatekeeper, but also a gateway. Since the very beginning of the reform and opening up by Deng Xiaoping, Taiwan investors, Taiwan academics had played the role as a gateway, not only invested in China, but also bring about the modern legal, system and concept, and helped China to rewrite their domestic regulations and laws, and brought about Taiwan's management skills and the mentality into Taiwan. So Taiwan, during the past 40 years, had played also a role of a gateway. Right now, all the official contact had been stopped. No one in Beijing will pick up the phone or answer text messages from Taiwan officials. But looking into the future, if we believe that the Chinese Communist Party will not be in power forever, if we believe that the Marxism and Leninism is not immortal, and if we believe that the vast Chinese intellectuals will be one day stands up and say that we will do very best and we will elect our own national leader. If China is going to democracy, I think Taiwan's very existence and Taiwan's long experience can serve as a useful function and play an important role as a gateway to China. So I hope that people in Washington, people in the Biden administration will see Taiwan not only as a shield, as a gatekeeper, but also a gateway in the future when the time is fit, and work for the bilateral interest of the United States and Taiwan. So in conclusion, I want to say that I give a high mark to the first 100 days of the Biden administration on Taiwan. And I commend the efforts of the Foreign Service officers on both sides in Washington as well as in Taipei. And I thank for my former colleagues at Ministry of Foreign Affairs and working very hard at TECRO in Washington and TECO in Atlanta. And everybody play an important role, and I appreciate the first 100 days, and I think we have a sound foundation, and if we continue to work on such basis, we can expect a relatively smooth U.S.-Taiwan relations as we look into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Huang, for this great insight about U.S.-Taiwan relations, especially in Biden's first 100 days. And I believe President Biden will be happy to learn that he got high mark. Professor Huang is a very serious teacher, so high mark is great. So we appreciate the Taiwan's insight, Taiwan's perspective. The next speaker, Professor Michael Hunsaker, will tell us or give us some insight from Americans' perspective. Before his formal presentation, I'd like to briefly introduce Professor Hunsaker from George Mason University. Professor Hunsaker is an assistant professor at George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government, where he also served as associate director of the Center for Security Policy Study. His study on war termination, military learning, and conventional deterrence have appeared in Security Study and Journal of Strategic Studies, Parameters, Defense One, and War on the Rock. We have co-authored one piece on that as well. He has also co-authored monograph on conventional deterrence in Northeastern Europe and the Taiwan Strait. Professor Hunsaker's book on the First World War, Dining to Learn, Wartime Lesson from the Western Front, will be published by Cornell University Press this July. Congratulations. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Berkeley, as well as a PhD, a doctoral degree, MPA degree, and another master's degree from Princeton University. Prior to attending a graduate school, Michael served as an amphibious assault vehicle officer in the U.S. Marine Corps from 2000 to 2006, deploying to Iraq in 2003 and 2004, and training Taiwanese Marine in 2005. According to what you just learned from his resume, awesome and a very, very, very unique resume, I'm sure he will give us a very interesting and important insight. But before his talk, I'd like to recognize some of the special guests who joined us today. We have my friend, Professor Li Dazhong from Taikang University joining us today. We also have Taiwanese, a young generation legislator, Mark Ho, He Zhiwei, joining us in the audience. We also have Professor Shelley Lin from University of Virginia. Professor Lin is with us as well. We have Professor Ye Yaoyuan from University of St. Thomas with us. I believe we introduced most of us, and also I appreciate everyone joining us today. So without further ado, I'm talking too much. Welcome, Professor Michael Hunziker, to share with us some insight. Thank you, Michael.
Well, Dennis, if you think you're talking too much, just wait till I get going. But first off, just thank you for the glowing introduction. Thank you as well, Dean Lee and your entire political science department for organizing this and for hosting me. And thank you also, Professor Huang, for those excellent remarks. I think there's going to be a lot of synergy and parallel. Now, I had planned to use slides, but honestly, regardless of where you're tuning in from, it's almost certainly too late or too early. So I'm not going to use the slides. I'm just going to get right to it. But before I outline my own very modest thinking on U.S. Taiwan relations, and I must admit I'm very new to studying this, unlike most of you on the call, I have to engage in some standard academic hand waving. It's just not easy, at least from where I sit, stuck here in San Antonio, even though I teach at George Mason University in the middle of a global pandemic, to reach anything approximating a clear-cut conclusion with only about 100 days of data to go on. And I'm even more reluctant to infer too much because events seem to be moving so much more quickly than even in the short time that I've been following these issues. The new administration is understandably eager to put its mark on foreign policy. Meanwhile, it's navigating some really profound challenges here in the United States. Allies and partners around the world are adjusting and reacting accordingly, as is China. So hot takes are always risky, but this speed and momentum give me even more reason for caution. After all, what transpires over the next 100 days, let alone the next 1,000 days, could easily cast these first few months in a different light than I see them right now. So with that in mind, I would ask, please take everything that follows as more of an intellectual exercise designed to be somewhat deliberately provocative, to spark conversation, rather than as a definitive statement or claim. So I'll structure the rest of my remarks as follows. First, I'd like to highlight 3 basic conclusions I think it's more or less safe to reach this early in the game. Then I'm going to discuss 3 challenges that I think will await Taipei and Washington almost regardless of how we interpret and understand the last few months. And finally, because conversations about Taiwan can often take on an almost pessimistic tenor, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, I'm going to conclude by mentioning a number of important opportunities that I think the United States and Taiwan can and I think are exploiting. So let me start by identifying what I see as 3 lessons, 3 relatively safe bets that even I, as the most risk-averse of gamblers, am willing to make. The first is that when it comes to U.S.-Taiwan relations, I expect to see far more continuity than change between this administration and its predecessor. Despite all of, for lack of a better term, the hand-wringing that we saw in Taipei, the Biden team has made it abundantly clear that it is not about to go soft on China. China remains the pacing challenge and this administration's top diplomatic, military, and economic priority. And it speaks volumes, I think, that President Biden announced America's withdrawal from Afghanistan a mere 2 days before his meeting with Prime Minister Suga. The message I take from that is clear. The Indo-Pacific is America's priority theater of action. China is its chief competitor. And the United States and this administration is willing to make tough choices to focus its resources and its power on the problem set. At this point, I also think it's safe to say that any fears that Washington might seek some sort of grand rapprochement with Beijing at Taiwan's expense can now be definitively put to rest. After all, the Biden team has yet to revisit even the Trump-era tariffs on Chinese goods, and it probably didn't go unnoticed that Beijing, at least in Beijing, that Secretaries Blinken and Austin forced their Chinese counterparts to chase them to Anchorage to have their first meeting in March. Now, there are critics who might counter everything I've just said by pointing out that many of Biden's senior officials also occupied important positions in the Obama administration. To this, I'll simply reiterate something that I've heard a smart observer point out. The Biden team may represent the same cast of characters as the Obama administration, but their character has changed. Accordingly, officials who might have played a role in formulating a more reactionary and accommodating China policy under President Obama have long since had what Josh Rogin refers to as an awakening about the true nature of the CCP and the scope of the challenge that it presents to the United States. In the same vein, I've seen nothing over the past few months to suggest that President Biden is going to reset his predecessor's reset on U.S. Taiwan relations. The symbolic evidence in this regard is overwhelming. For the first time since 1979, Taiwan's representative to the United States was invited to a presidential inauguration. The administration has offered Taiwan high-level statements of support from the White House, the State Department, and the Department of Defense. Secretary of Defense Austin called the U.S. commitment to Taiwan rock solid in his confirmation hearing. And not even 24 hours later, Secretary of State Blinken said the United States would live up to its obligations under the Taiwan Relations Act in his confirmation hearing. And then just a few months ago, in a nationally televised interview, Blinken said it would be a terrible mistake for China to attack Taiwan. Nor has the administration made any significant changes to the Trump administration's last-minute guidance on meetings with Taiwanese officials. Instead, the Biden administration sent the U.S. ambassador to Palau to Taipei as part of an official delegation. And in what seems like an unambiguous attempt at reassuring Taiwan, President Biden sent Chris Dodd, Richard Armitage, and James Steinberg to meet President Tsai at the same time as he sent John Kerry to discuss climate cooperation with China. The Biden team has also undertaken far more substantive steps. U.S. Navy ships have conducted at least 4 freedom of navigation operations through the Taiwan Strait since President Biden took office. In the wake of the new Chinese Coast Guard law, the administration authorized a memorandum of understanding between the U.S. and Taiwanese Coast Guards. And it goes without saying that the administration was willing to expend real political capital to push Japan to include statements of support for Taiwan in both the March 2+2 dialogue and in April's joint summit between Biden and Suga. Second, I also think it's safe to suggest that to the degree that we should expect to see any changes in U.S.-Taiwan relations in the next few years, I think such shifts will mostly involve the Biden administration's overarching preference for multilateral action. I also tend to think Biden officials will continue to downplay the more transactional aspects of the U.S. relationship with allies and partners in the region to include Taiwan, while underscoring and instead emphasizing shared values and interests. As a result, and echoing some of what Professor Huang said, I'm cautiously optimistic that this administration will be more likely to treat Taiwan as an end unto itself and less like a bargaining chip or a useful way to poke China in the eye. I also expect to see much less emphasis on the sorts of bellicose rhetoric and symbolic gestures that seem more likely than not to provoke Beijing without measurably enhancing our ability to actually make good on our threats and our assurances. My third and final safe bet is that I do not expect President Biden to move from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity. That said, I do think we're going to continue to see this administration explore and test strategic ambiguity's conceptual boundaries. For example, I could easily imagine an uptick in the number of increasingly important US officials visiting Taipei under various guises, deeper economic integration, more mill-to-mill collaboration behind the scenes, more memoranda of understanding, so on and so forth. But I don't see this administration having an appetite to make that final leap from ambiguity to clarity. My instinct, and it's truly nothing more than that, is that this administration thinks of strategic clarity as high risk and low reward. My guess is that this administration doubts strategic clarity will do more to deter Taiwan or China, because I get the sense that Chinese military planners already assume the United States will intervene in a cross-strait conflict and are planning accordingly. But at least from the Biden administration's perspective, my sense is that a high-profile, unambiguous shift from clarity could well paint Xi in a corner, forcing him to act in ways that might turn into something of a dangerous, self-fulfilling prophecy. If I'm right about all of this or any of this, and again, that's a big if because I'm drawing some major conclusions from a very small sample, but if I'm right, this should all come as fairly good news for most Taiwanese observers. After all, it implies that the island should continue to enjoy increased attention and reassurance, at least to the same degree that it received from the Trump administration, but in a more predictable way, and without the unhelpfully confrontational rhetoric that sometimes, again, seemed designed more to provoke than to deter. At the same time, I'm not entirely sure I'm ready to put myself in the optimistic camp yet. My personal, and again, this is highly tentative, my personal take is that U.S.-Taiwan relations are moving in a more productive and sustainable direction, but that serious obstacles and challenges remain. So now I'll take a moment to highlight 3 which I'm going to order in terms of priority and urgency again, as I see them. The first has to do with defense reform. Not to put too fine a point on it, and I say this among friends, but I think Taiwan can and should do more to provide for its own defense. Frankly, I'm increasingly worried that Beijing is deterred in spite of Taiwan's defenses, not because of them. And I've yet to speak to a defense expert in the United States or in the region who thinks that the island is doing enough. Defense spending remains lower than it should, given the size and proximity of the threat, although I take very seriously Professor Huang's comments about the perception gap. Meanwhile, the Ministry of National Defense continues to prioritize high-profile, high-cost weapons, despite at some point rhetorically embracing asymmetry. Now, I've written a lot about these concerns, and I'm not going to rehash the details here. I also fully acknowledge that the Tsai administration has done a lot of very important and challenging work to push for change. President Tsai has made reserve reform a high-profile issue. She's pushing for more asymmetry, and she routinely appears in public wearing combat gear. In a sense, she is saying and doing all of the right things. And yet I cannot help but notice from the confines of my house in San Antonio, her administration seems reluctant to invest real political capital into forcing change on the Ministry of National Defense. MND's rhetorical, but clearly not substantive commitment to asymmetry is revealing in this regard. For at least a decade now, American analysts have called on Taiwan to adopt an asymmetric posture by acquiring large numbers of cheap weapons, things like drones, coastal defense missiles, and mines, in order to flip the anti-access challenge on China. I've gone a step further and called for the island to reconstitute its reserve force as a territorial defense force in order to enhance deterrence and to deter against aggression by threatening to wage an insurgency. And for a while, it seemed like the Ministry of National Defense was going to go in this direction, not the territorial defense force, that's probably a bridge too far, but the asymmetry, especially after Admiral Lee unveiled the overall defense concept. And yet here we are, 4 years later, and Taiwan's 2021 Quadrennial Defense Review, which I have read cover to cover, makes abundantly clear that the island's defensive posture remains asymmetric in name only. Fighter jets and surface ships grace the manual. There are far more references in the QDR to indigenous production, fighting for sea control, and the need for decidedly symmetric conventional capabilities. And I see no plans for anything resembling a territorial defense force. Combine that with rumors that the United States is about to approve a request for M109 Paladin self-propelled howitzers. I was an armor officer. These are decidedly conventional weapons. Or that Taiwan just launched its first domestically produced amphibious transport ship. It's hard not to conclude that MND is less than serious about pursuing asymmetry. I'm belaboring the point and beating the horse to death because I think defense reform is an important issue for a number of reasons. First, I, along with many others, think Taiwan's current posture undermines cross-strait stability and deterrence. This is because it does not and cannot slam the door shut on any hopes that Beijing might harbor about achieving some sort of fait accompli victory over the island. The fact is, the cross-strait military balance has shifted so decisively in China's favor that the island's defenders cannot possibly hope to match the PLA ship for ship, jet for jet, sub for sub, or tank for tank. Second, even if Taiwan is counting on American assistance in an all-out invasion scenario, and to be clear, I'm not saying I think such an attack is inevitable, but I'd rather keep the odds as low as humanly possible. The fact is that America may not be able to arrive quickly or decisively. I'm not trying to imply that China can or will defeat the United States, but I do think there's reason to believe they can impose serious costs on the United States as it tries to project power from Japan, Guam, and the American homeland. And let's be honest, the United States is out of practice trying to project that much military power across those kinds of distances in the amount of time it's going to take China to cross 90 miles of water. A genuinely asymmetric defensive posture will therefore be far superior in terms of allowing the island to hold out, to act as the shield, and to hold the door open for American intervention should the need arise, thereby enhancing deterrence and stability. Third, defense reforms of this magnitude, they take time. And by time, I'm talking about years, if not decades. Doctrine, training, logistics, leadership, culture, all of these things have to change to meaningfully enhance deterrence. And these are not the kinds of changes Taiwan can wait to undertake until a crisis is already underway. Now, I've heard pundits claim that China will have to fight its way through the streets, fight insurgents and fight guerrillas if it hopes to take the island. But as somebody who has waged counterinsurgency and somebody who has studied it, insurgencies are rarely spontaneous and unplanned, especially in a place that's, let's be frank, short on guns and serious military experience. The same can be said of public opinion polls that show more and more Taiwanese willing to fight, even as Taiwan's military struggles to recruit enough volunteers to fill out the ranks of its frontline combat forces. The bottom line is that if Taiwan wants China and the United States to take its defenses seriously, it must start investing in them seriously right now. And let me also be clear, defense reform is not just a problem for Taiwan. The United States military is also in the process of trying to reorient itself after a multi-decade global war on terror, at the same time that it's trying to transform itself for a potential great power conflict during a so-called revolutionary period in military affairs. Any of these transitions would be difficult on their own, and the Department of Defense really has no choice, given decisions made over the past 20 years, to undertake all of them simultaneously. Changes of this scale, of course, cost a lot of money, and the jury is still out since the Biden administration is in the very early stages of formulating its first defense budget. But I don't think it's unreasonable to be concerned that the Biden team might soon face some difficult choices and trade-offs between the scope of its domestic and foreign policy ambitions and the wherewithal it has to accomplish them. The second challenge involves the administration's preference for multilateralism. Now, there's no question in my mind this is a good thing. There's no question in my mind the Biden team is committed to working with like-minded allies and partners to compete with and to deter China. Again, these are unquestionably good things. And the Biden team has done an impressive job of working towards this goal, despite only having been in office for 100 days and having very little prep time on the front end. I do, however, wonder about the degree to which our like-minded allies and partners are actually like-minded when it comes to Taiwan. Getting allies to express high-level rhetorical support for stability in the Taiwan Straits is obviously an important first step. It's an obstacle in its own right. But if the Biden administration is serious about presenting a credible, unified front so as to deter Chinese aggression against Taiwan before it happens, it's going to need more out of its allies. Otherwise, I'm worried that it's not hard to imagine a scenario in which a Taiwan crisis drives a wedge between America and at least some of its allies and partners instead of bringing them together. To avoid this scenario, I think the United States needs clearer answers on a range of very difficult questions that simply just can't be addressed in public. For example, how much do our allies and partners really care about Taiwan, and what are they willing to risk to maintain the status quo? Warm feelings and pineapple buying campaigns are a good start, but in a crisis, the United States is going to need diplomatic solidarity in the face of assured retribution. It's going to need access to bases. It's going to need logistical support, and it may even need help fighting. The history of coalition warfare is clear on this point. These things are best coordinated well in advance, not on the fly. Again, especially if the goal is to deter war instead of waging it. The United States also needs to do more to understand the fears and concerns of its allies and partners. I'm sure more than a few are worried that the more they undertake steps to prepare for a cross-strait contingency, the greater it is the risk the United States, because of these differences in perception of threat, that the United States might be the one who drags them into a war they did not want. And it goes without saying that all of our allies know that even if the United States prevails in a war over Taiwan, when the dust settles, China will still be in their proverbial backyard, and the United States will still be thousands of miles away. These are obviously sensitive issues. My hope is that we can and are having frank conversations behind closed doors, because if we aren't, I'm very concerned multilateralism may not prove to be the force multiplier we're all hoping it will be. The third and final challenge revolves around the tricky balancing act that Washington and Taipei must perform as they try to mobilize voters and convince voters to pay attention to the threat without also overstating the threat in counterproductive ways. I'll use as an example the Ministry of National Defense's decision to track Chinese incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. On the one hand, this move clearly attunes Taiwanese voters to the nature of the threat and to the extent of Chinese provocations. On the other hand, publicly tracking incursions puts M&D in the difficult position of having to do something so it looks like it's protecting Taiwan. And the result seems to be this marked increase in Taiwanese Air Force intercept missions, even though many of China's incursions are actually in distant corners of the so-called ADIZ, And these intercepts are now starting to wear down Taiwanese pilots and aircraft, adversely impacting readiness. Worse yet, China seems to have noticed as it starts to fly older and older aircraft into the ADIZ as sort of what we might call a cost imposition strategy. Now, as challenging as this balancing act is for Taipei, I'm actually a bit more concerned with how the Biden administration handles it. Increasingly, it seems like being pro-Taiwan and anti-China is a quick and easy way to score political points in the United States. And to be frank, some US reporting on cross-strait issues is becoming rather breathless. It's little wonder that Richard Bush, Bonnie Glaser, and Ryan Haas saw it necessary to call on everyone in an op-ed to tone down their rhetoric. Personally, I start to get wary when I see politicians as dissimilar as Barney Frank and Josh Hawley on the same side of an issue. To be sure, I applaud the increasingly broad and bipartisan support for Taiwan as much, if not more than anyone. But as a political scientist, I recognize it does not take much for bipartisanship to morph into log rolling, especially in the heat of a crisis. For now, I have no reason to doubt that cooler heads will prevail within the Biden team. I just think it's something to keep an eye on because it can be very hard to avoid rallying the people around the flag and demonizing the opponent in moments of crisis and unrest. So enough with the downer notes. Let me conclude with an optimistic note by highlighting at least 3 opportunities that I think the Biden administration can and probably is exploiting as it moves forward. The first concerns opportunities to exploit the so-called gray zone. Now, by gray zone, I'm referring to typically we refer to China's uses of cyber attacks, air and maritime intrusions, disinformation, criminal subversion to change facts on the ground and to undermine Taiwanese resolve without triggering a kinetic response. Now, leaving aside the question of whether these sorts of provocations could ever prove decisive in their own right, the fact is that we sometimes focus too much on what China can do to Taiwan in the gray zone without also considering what Taiwan and the United States can and are doing to flip the challenge around. The fact is that unless we define gray zone operations as something only adversaries can do to us, it strikes me that we have and we are making rather effective use of the gray zone as well. After all, what are freedom of navigation operations, memorandum of understanding, arms sales, and official visits to Taipei by sitting US ambassadors, if not a deliberate and coordinated attempt to test boundaries, create maneuver space, and change facts on the ground without giving the other side a legitimate excuse to respond kinetically. So I think it's heartening to see the United States and the Biden team relying on the gray zone playbook the United States helped write decades ago. And I'm hopeful we're going to see more of this moving forward. The second opportunity, I think, stems from Taiwan's current moment in the sun. Much of this, in turn, stems from the island's superb handling of the pandemic. Some of it's also probably due to the fact that many Western news agencies moved their foreign bureaus from Hong Kong to Taipei. Either way, this increased attention may not be without its own potential drawbacks, but on the margins, I think it is very beneficial for Taiwan. It's a good opportunity to exploit and for the Biden administration to leverage as it hopefully continues to make the case to the American people that Taiwan is something they should care about. China is creating the third opportunity by how it's playing its hand. Wolf warrior diplomacy, maritime militias, atrocities against its own citizens, lashing out at its corporate and national critics alike, its military buildup, and of course, its crackdown in Hong Kong, which gives lie to the one country, two systems. I'm not a China expert, so I'm not sure if these are the result of miscalculations and missteps, or if Beijing genuinely thinks it has enough economic, diplomatic, and military clout that it no longer has to care. Either way, China is giving the United States and Taiwan and their allies and partners around the region an excuse, if not a motive, to collaborate and coordinate more deeply than they ever have before. The current administrations in both Taipei and Washington strike me as particularly well suited to take advantage of this opportunity and this opening, and to do so in a coherent and strategic way. So I've gone on too long. Thank you for this opportunity and for humoring some of my tentative speculation. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Professor Hansekers. Well, that's great insight. Well, a lot of things. I took a lot of notes. I believe all of our audience from Zoom, the meeting room, and also online, the YouTube viewers, they have a lot of questions and also learn a lot from both Taiwan and U.S. perspective. Before our, we start our Q&A session, please submit your questions, through the chat room, and I will collect the questions. But before we start the Q&A session, because of the editing purpose, I have to stop the live streaming from on YouTube and focus on the Zoom discussion. So thank you for joining us. If you are watching us on YouTube, thank you for joining us. And hopefully you will pay attention to Political Science Department at Sam Houston State University's YouTube channel. We will post